We're starting. And a good morning to everyone. We have been studying the book of Matthew. We should be this morning coming to one of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, and I'm not going there. Don't get upset about that. The dog's already upset that I didn't do what I promised to do. But I studied all week to do a Beatitude. I got all the way up to Thursday looking at these things and wanting to go into that. And I was really excited about what I was going to deliver on this whole thing on blessed are the peacemakers. But I came to Friday morning when I sat down to write, and I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I don't know about you, but I've looked at 2020, and if there was a year that I could skip, if God had said, we can just take one of these back and not deal with it, I would love to take this one off the table and just say enough. And in thinking about that, in thinking about the frustration, as I look at my son and the frustration he's feeling, and I look at family members and friends and what they're coping with, I came back to a very different verse this morning. And I've come here a number of times, and if some of you have been here when I've visited this verse before, my apologies to you. Try to look interested. But we're going to go back, and I want to look at James instead in chapter 1. And I want to look starting at verse 2. And I'm sure this is a verse you have heard. I doubt this is new to any of you. It is an interesting section. He says this here in James 1:2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, that you may be mature and complete and not lacking anything. I've asked groups through the years a number of times to share their favorite verse. I will let you know right now, this one has never come up among anybody's list of favorite verses. And I'm going to have to tell you, I've had to add it to mine. I have, over the time, come to appreciate this one. And especially as I look at this year, the frustrations, the things that have happened, I had to come here one more time before the end of the year to think about this. Yes, we're in the grip of a pandemic as I look at this. I want to warn you here, if I wax political, I want you to understand that I'm not trying to do a political presentation. But I do want to put some context to this of why I think we need to revisit this a little bit. As I said, and I saw a number of you nod your heads, would 2020 be a one you'd take off the table if you possibly could? I think so. And it isn't just the pandemic. It isn't just that the shutdowns that have occurred, but to be honest, the trends I'm seeing in our culture that have been highlighted by what we've going through, the things that are being said, because to be very blunt and to be politically incorrect, I'll tell you this, it is not the specter of the illness that might be fatal that is disturbing this year. It is so much how this pandemic and how this has been used politically, socially, and economically to transform a nation. Because I think there's purpose in that. I'll be very blunt with you. I don't really honestly believe that many of the people who are making the decisions for us right now are doing so purely on the basis of what they think to be the issues of public health and safety. I really don't think that's what's on the minds of many people anymore, and I will explain why in a moment. But these shutdowns that are supposed to save lives are really shattering them. I read an article just this morning I found stunning. In Japan, suicides have now outstripped COVID deaths. More suicides than COVID deaths in the nation. There's a simple reality to this. Murder rates are skyrocketing around our country. Now, other crime is down because people aren't out doing things anymore, but murder rates are up, especially among people who live together, among families, among friends, and people who know each other, in neighborhoods. We've been crammed into these things. Murder rates are skyrocketing. Suicide rates, as I said. Depression is off the charts right now, and the list can go on. Because there's a simple reality that we're not addressing as we talk about health, and that is that man is a social creature. And that you cannot isolate him, you cannot cut him off from all of the things around him without having a negative impact. Unemployment rates are off the charts. Businesses closing their doors, never to reopen. I was talking to two people I know very well that are restaurant owners. And they have talked about how they have just been hanging by a thread, and now they're being told that for 3 weeks They are not going to be allowed to even have outside dining. And they said, really, quite frankly, this is it. We don't have the reserves. We don't have the resources. We can't survive this one last time. And you think about that. Companies like Disney, Microsoft, that are having to lay off tens of thousands, they have at least a reserve, a means to weather this, but most businesses do not. And people are wondering if they have a future. And I'll tell you, I feel rather confident in this. If you ask some people this, would you rather go back out and work, running the risk and knowing you might catch a disease that could end your life, or would you rather stay home to escape the disease and know that you might lose everything you have? Which would you choose? And I'm willing to say, quite confidently, I think most people would say, I'll take the risk. I'll wonder if I'm one of the 5 or 6% that may catch this disease, and among those that do catch it, whether I'll be one of the 1 or 2% who might die from it. But I know that if I don't work, I'll lose everything I have. My family will lose it all. I look at this, I see a nation being stripped of freedom in the name of health and science. And I tell you that I'm not convinced because of the hypocrisy of what I see in those actions. And again, if it sounds political, I apologize. We're going to get to the verse here in a second, but I'm trying to articulate a nation's fears, that I get it, that I understand what they're dealing with, that somehow when a Christian looks at a state saying that the church must be shut down, but an abortion clinic, an alcohol center has to be open as critical services. In California, entertainment has been named as a critical service that cannot be closed. And I find it hard to see where the making of a TV series rates with a person's need to interact and worship their God. They need to fellowship with others. I'm just not convinced these things come together. I see protests and rallies that are considered public health issues and must be protected by the First Amendment, and I see letters coming to people like John MacArthur that warn him that if he does not abide by the rules, he could face 6 months in jail. You wonder how this works. And I just mentioned we got a Supreme Court ruling, didn't we? 5-4. The Supreme Court ruled that the state cannot restrict churches, and that's in New York, not in California yet. But I want you to think about that ruling for just a moment. 5-4. If you recognize how close we came to having that be on the other side of that, that had not been for the tragic death of one Supreme Court justice and the appointment at the last minute of another, it would have been 5-4 the other way. On this issue, now I want you to just stop. Do you know how the First Amendment reads? Very simply this. It says this, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people to assemble or the right of the people to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. I'm not a legal scholar, but I'm going to ask you this. Can you find in there anything that's ambiguous about the right that we have to assemble and worship our God? How can that be 5-4? And yet we hear right now that many people want to pack the courts with new understanding that would change that ruling and end it. And again, I say I'm not trying to be political, but I understand why people are upset. I get why they doubt and wonder about their future. I get why we're feeling that something's amiss. I understand that we're looking at a time when people are talking about laws that must be passed that will tell us it is illegal for us to read some of these passages out loud in Scripture in a church setting because they're considered hate speech now. We're in a time when we're wondering what's going on. And I thought it would be good to come back and consider something here because quite frankly, as Americans, we're a little bit spoiled. We're not used to facing uncertain times. We're not used to facing restrictions on how we worship, what we can say or what we can study and understand from God. It's very different from us now. And I thought it would be good for us to come back here and try to understand something because God never promised us those protections. God never said that there would be a place that he would establish, one nation where we would, under God, where we would see to it that we would never have to deal with such things. It's not in the text anywhere. Instead, he gives us a couple of things. I always go to Peter, who said, don't be surprised when the world turns on you. Why are you shocked? And I have to come to this one where it says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials. I want to start with that one. Notice what it says. I would prefer it said this. If I got to write it, I would like to say, consider it pure joy if you happen to face a trial. But does the text say that? What does it say? When. What does when tell you right away? It's coming. It's not something that's possible. It's not something that we might have to deal with. It isn't an outside chance. It's going to happen when you face trials. And then it has that next one that I, again, if it get up to me, I wouldn't have written it this way. Notice what it says, of many kinds. There are cultures that have a coming of age trial and test. All through time, a number of cultures have done this, where they have that rite of passage, a trial that a young man or a young woman has to undergo to determine if they're ready for adulthood. And once they have passed that trial, they are an adult. It is behind them. They never have to face it again. God does not say there's going to come a time in your life when you meet that trial that's going to set everything right and put you right before God, and you'll never have to deal with it again. He says many kinds. He says, I'm going to be refining you for the entirety of your life. And for some of us, as we're getting old enough to look back on more of it than we're looking forward to, it tells us something. There's never going to be a time when God does not bring trials into our lives. Many kinds. I'll ask you that. What is the hardest thing about a trial for you? Any kind of trial. What is it that just makes it frustrating for you?
Not knowing.
Yeah.
Not knowing. There's the next one. Why? That's mine. Now, I don't know if you're built like me. My job, the reason I've loved my job for 44 years, the reason I'm going to miss it, and I'm not looking forward to retirement like some of you did, I look back, and what happens in my job is they bring me a problem. The professor comes in and says, here's what I need to do. I need a device that will go on the ocean floor, that will record this, that can deal with currents, that can deal with storm conditions. I need all these parameters met, and I only have this much to spend, and I need it Friday. Okay. I love that. To fix something, to sit down and sort and solve the puzzle. I really enjoy making something right, to create something out of nothing, to take a problem and resolve it. And here's what I hate about trials. God doesn't let me fix it. I don't get to take it out of the bench in the garage and pull out the tool chest and tinker with it till it's right. I can't resolve it necessarily. God doesn't give me a problem to solve. He gives me an issue to endure. They can't be reworked sometimes. They can't be refined. They can't be... I have found this, that the biggest thing that often happens in trials for me is that when I come to the end of it, God has not changed my circumstances at all, but He has changed my perspective a great deal. And that's a hard one for me to cope with, because I want a resolution. I want to know an answer. And God doesn't always give that. I want to talk about trials then a little bit. Any type of trial. And we've had our share this year. Any number of you, I know, for prayer lists and the things I can look back on that we've been praying for, we've had them. Setbacks to our ministry, things that were going great guns that suddenly we're struggling to get 12 kids and we were dealing with hundreds a week. It's different, isn't it? The things we're trying to deal with in jobs where we've always worked and suddenly we can't, where things are changing. As I said, it's been a tough year for cancers. I've said goodbye. I've been unable to say goodbye to two very close and dear friends that I was not allowed to talk to, not allowed to see. They died alone. Not even their families allowed to be with them. Maybe it's an illness that you can't resolve. Maybe it's a problem with a child, that a relationship that you just can't make right. There's Any number of things, the loss of a loved one. I've always loved this from Job. It says this, man is born to sorrow as the sparks fly upward. You've been camping? You campers? I love that. I don't know what it is about an evening by a campsite where you're just tending the fire. And just that thing where you get that bed of coals and you're feeding the different pieces back in, and you have to leave just enough of an air pocket for that thing to catch up. And you take that stick and you're stirring it. And when you do that, have you ever watched the sparks shooting up in the heat? Can you count them? I get the illustration from a life that is very much that just tending to life, just dealing with the things to keep stuff going in life, to make things happen the way it's supposed to, that just the course of life is going to cause those things to occur. It's living. It's how things are going to happen. And I have to say, if I'm honest, that even in the best moments, and I have to admit, God has been very gracious to me. I have been blessed with the greatest partner in life I could ask for. The relationship I have with my children, I can't ask for better than that. And yet, for my wife and I don't believe there's any prolonged period where we have not had to deal with some issue. It's always something. It's always something. So let's talk about trials a little bit this morning. Why does God bring them? Why does it have to be when? Why does it have to be many? And what should be my attitude toward them? Let's try to take this apart a little bit and see if we can't give it. And of course, if we're going to go someplace to look at the ultimate illustration of trials in a life, where should we go? Job. Obviously Job. So let's go to Genesis and look at Abraham. Chapter 22 of Genesis. I picked this one specifically because I relate to this one better than I do anything else, because this talks to me about what makes a trial frustrating. A number of you said this. The question why, the question what's going on, this one has to be. I believe Abraham had one of the toughest trials ever because of several factors. One is this. Any parent here knows this. What bothers you more than anything that happens to you? What happens to your kids? That just tears you up, doesn't it? You bleed for that. You want to solve that. That's our biggest problem in parenting, is knowing how to step back, because we always want to step in and try to take over and fix it. And you can't. You just can't always make it right. But this is perhaps the worst. And God puts on Abraham something I would never want to face. And it sounds like he's rubbing it in. I want you to listen to this. Chapter 22 in Genesis. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. Get that? God is purposing to test Abraham. I want you to understand that. If you have a translation from that James passage that says many temptations, cross that out and put is not temptations, it's trials. It's a test. The word is not temptations. God doesn't tempt us to sin. Can we sin in a trial? Oh boy, you can. But God is not testing you. He's not tempting you to sin. He's testing you to find out something. So God tests Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, here I am. Abraham, you think Abraham probably is looking forward to a visit from God. Remember what God did for Abraham just shortly before this? Gave him a son. Late in life, when it never should have happened. Abraham got the greatest, and God's visiting again. Abraham's going, boy, this is going to be good. When God visits, good things happen. Here I am. And then God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. Now, what's God doing here? Kind of rubbing it in, isn't it? I mean, come on. It's my son, my only son. Yeah, I love him. Where are we going with this? And then he says this. And go to the region of Moriah, and sacrifice him them as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Okay. Anybody got a problem with this so far? All right. Talk about something that doesn't make sense. That's why I like this one, and it helps me to relate. Because there comes a test in life when you look at it and nothing makes sense. First off, is this the kind of thing that you see God doing? This was the pagan gods that asked for this sort of stuff. This was the evil of Baal and the other. That's not what God does. Not only that, what God is demanding, this particular child is a child of promise. Remember what promise came with Isaac? This is the son of promise. This is the son that's going to bring a great nation into being. This is the son that's going to be the line that leads to Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. This is God's promise. God made this happen, and God's going to undo it? Nothing here makes sense. Nothing here fits the image you'd like to have. It just doesn't work. God is going to make a point here. He's going to teach some truths to Abraham, and he's going to learn some things. But the trial is beginning, and I want you to notice something about Abraham. He's got a trial. It's something he does not want to do. It is something that he does not see as making sense in life. And notice there's a response in verse 3. Early in the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Okay. Is this how you would have handled it? I want you to think about this. Now, of all the times where someone had a right to question God, I mean, in the book of Job, there's this whole series there, and then there's this question, and God goes, where were you when I laid the foundation of the world? God basically says, where do you get off questioning me on any of this stuff? I've never needed your advice before. I somehow managed to get by without you telling me how things ought to be done. But Abraham is a guy that later will have an argument with God. Remember, Abraham had his argument with God, saying, well, let's just talk about this Sodom and Gomorrah thing, shall we? But wouldn't you think if there was a time when someone had the right to say, God, I love you, but I really need an explanation on this one. I don't get this. Let me tell you something about trials immediately that we learn from this first section. The first response to a trial needs to be this. No matter how the situation appears, no matter how unlikely a solution seems to be in the offering, no matter how hard we think it's going to be, the beginning point is to do what God says. To come back to God's word and find out what he said and to move forward on that. And I'll tell you, there are situations in which doing what God says seems to be making the problem worse. There are points in life when doing what God wants us to do, when testifying the way we're supposed to, when living and talking in the way we're supposed to, we know it's going to cause the issue to get worse. In our minds, we're sure it's not the best choice. And the beginning point here is very clear. I'm going to do what God said, whether I understand how this is going to work out or not. And this is where Abraham begins. And he doesn't hesitate. I mean, you would think there should be a little bit, I'd love to get going tomorrow. But, it's a bad season for traveling. We'll have to wait probably till the winter's done. And we can't go in summer, too hot. It is a desert region, you understand. We'll have to and there's only a few spring days, and, it rains. There could have been any number of things he could have tried to figure out here to put this off and not do it. And Abraham, against every emotion in his body, gets up the next day and says, I'm going to act on what God said. That's a tough one. How did he have the capacity to do that? I mean, could you have taken that command? It's amazing we get the commentary for this someplace entirely different. This is from Hebrews. This is chapter 11. And starting in verse 17, I believe. Yes. It says, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac up as a sacrifice. He who had received the promise was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." How did he do it? Abraham reasoned that God would raise the dead. Now, doesn't say that in our passage. And I want you to understand something here. Abraham had never heard of this happening. This is before any of the prophets had done such a thing. This is well long before Jesus would raise the dead. Abraham had no concept that such a thing was possible. So why would Abraham believe that if God had to raise the dead to make this work, that's what he would do? Why would he think that? Because God had made a promise, and Abraham believed God. I want you to notice that it's in the text here. Early next morning, Abraham got up, saddled his donkey. He took him and his 2 servants with him, and they cut enough wood for all this, and they go, okay. And on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. And he said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back." Is he lying?
No.
God said, "You're going to have a son. Isaac's going to be the lion." I have no idea how God's going to pull this off. But we're going to go through, and we're coming back. Abraham took the wood from the burnt offering, placed it on his son Isaac, and he carried the fire and a knife, and the 2 of them went up together, and Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son." "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb?" Now, Isaac's no fool. He's looking, and Dad has a knife, and Dad has wood, and Dad has a purpose, and there's nobody but the 2 of them. And Isaac says, "Well, how are we pulling this off?" Notice the response. "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went together. God will figure this out. God will make this happen. Somehow or other, God's going to work this one out. How close did he come? Now, I want to put something else onto you. How does a man over 90 years old tie up a young kid and get him to lie there for the sacrifice?
There had to be faith on Isaac's part.
Yeah.
And obedience.
Isaac is trusting this, and that's a huge issue of trust as well.
Yes.
Yes.
It shows Abraham's trusting God and Isaac was trusting his dad. It's example.
The example through this, my dad means me no harm. My dad loves me. If this is what he thinks is right, that's a monstrous level of faith. We complain about the difficulty of trusting God through a great deal less stressful moments, I think, than this. God was going to keep a promise. What did Abraham put all of his faith on? God was a God of promise, and God kept his word. And if God said it'll work out, it'll work out. Why do we have trials like this? Why does God put us in positions that just seem insurmountable, that seem beyond our capacity to cope? Why does God do that? What does God have in mind? Number of reasons. I'd like to go through a few as we close this out. One purpose of trials is to test your faith. 2 Chronicles 32:31 says this about Hezekiah, that God tested him that he might know everything that was in his heart. Now I want you to stop for a second. God tested Hezekiah that he might know everything that was in his heart. Who is the he in view there? Hezekiah. God knew. Who needed to know the character of his own heart? Hezekiah did. One of the things that God does is testing us is to let us know where we stand. Just what kind of person are you really? God needs to let you understand that. You need to know the level of your spiritual strength. How will you respond in trouble? We always talk a good game about how we're going to stand up for our faith, but until you have to, do you really know how capable you are of doing it?
No.
And God needs you to know that. God needs you to know, I do have the strength. Or God needs you to know something, it looks like I didn't. I was talking a good game and I wasn't ready, and maybe there's a thing that needs to be changed. How do you respond in times of trouble? Do you drive everybody crazy around you, or are you a bastion of strength that causes them to have hope? We have watched that through this year and some of the leaders we have in our own church and how they've handled difficulty. It's been inspiring. I have news for you. I've lived long enough to see some that weren't so inspiring. I've lived long enough to have had moments when I wasn't terribly inspiring. And it's to my shame, but it was to my change as well. We look back on stupid moments and things we said to people and the things we did, and we can either take that and say it is time to change for God, or try to pretend it never happened. And which will you do when God's trial hits your heart? When you live life, what are you going to do? I've had people that just don't want to be happy, do not want to get through a trial. I've had family members that look for a reason never to be satisfied, to be sure that something bad is on the horizon. You heard that? You're looking at the thing and they're going, what if this, and what if this, and what if, and you go, wait a minute. We don't know if any of that's going to happen. We're fretting over things that might happen. How about we resolve what is happening right now? I love the scripture's comment on this. Let's deal with today. Tomorrow has enough worries of its own. Why create problems that haven't happened yet? Get through this one. Trial is going to tell you a lot about yourself, things you need to know. Try this one. Trials come to humble us. In 2 Corinthians 12:7, Paul talks about this, that God gave me a thorn in the flesh to keep me humble. Now, I want you to think about Paul, and I want you to understand something. A lot of us need to be humbled because we have a much higher opinion of ourselves than we should. But, you know, here's a reality. Some of you are really that much sharper than other people. You know what? In most situations where Paul looked out and said, I'm brighter than that guy. You know what? Paul was right. This was one of the intellects of his age when it talked about having a better and broader education, having more knowledge at your fingertips. Paul generally had more than anybody in the room. He was usually the smartest guy there any place he went. Here's the problem. Even if you're that good, you're really not as impressive as you think, because the standard is not the other people in the room, is it? What's the standard?
Jesus.
Yes. The standard is Christ. The standard is God. That's the standard we hold ourselves up to. And Paul had to be reminded of that at times because it was real easy to be better than everybody else he knew. For him, it was a cakewalk. You ever known the person that's just good at everything they try? No matter what they do, they succeed at it. If they set their mind to it, they're going to be a success. That's just the way they are. Anything they take on is going to be great. And God has to bring us back to reality sometimes, to humble us, to make us aware of that. Paul had to be humbled, and he talks about that. He said, you know, I was from the best tribe. I did all the best things, did everything a good Jew could do. If you looked and said, perfect Jew, Paul's picture should be plastered right there. And he said, I've had to learn that meant nothing compared to the grace of Christ. And in this passage in 2 Corinthians, he's saying, and God gave me insights he didn't give anybody else. I want you to understand this. Even compared to the other apostles, Paul got more than anybody. Who wrote almost all the doctrine we know about Jesus Christ in the New Testament? Paul does. And Paul had to be brought back and reminded, it isn't because you're so great. Arrogance and pride are very human traits. Trials come to break the world's hold on us. There's a point at which God has to remind us not to trust in our own resources and to think too highly of what this world offers us. There are times we need to remind of that. Man does not live by bread alone, but every word that comes from the mouth of God. There are times God has to crush all of the things you think you have to compel you to come back to where you should be and come back to this book. Trials remind us of our eternal hope. This is 2 Corinthians 4:16 and 17. Therefore, do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. If there's anything that I have found is missing in modern churches, this: we don't talk much about heaven anymore. We really don't have a perspective of looking forward. Where is God taking us? What is the eternal hope we have? What is it we really long for? In fact, most of our preaching is even now focused on this. God has a wonderful plan for your life. It's what he's going to do right now that seems to be our focus and what matters to us. And we forget that everything we do now is just to prepare us and move us to that ultimate hope that we have. We should be looking forward. We should have an expectation that says, I look forward to what God has for me in time. Trials reveal what we really love. You know, here's the thing. God is going to come after. I'm going to warn you on this one. God will cause a trial based on things you really value highly. He's going to go after things that you have put because he wants you to understand what really matters. And he's going to test where your love really lies, where your affections really lie. Deuteronomy 13:3, the Lord your God is testing you to find out whether you love him with all your heart and soul. And again, it isn't so God will find out if you love him with all your heart and soul. It's so that you'll know. Trials teach us to value the blessings of God. Psalm 63:3, your loving kindness is better than life. Hebrews 5:8, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Speaking of Christ there. Trials teach us to value the blessings of God. We can stop looking for God to do good things when good things are all we experience. And we stop giving God any credit for such things at times. And God wants us to stop and remember that he's the source of these. This one is really a big one for me. Trials enable us to help others in their suffering. I love this one. Jesus says to Peter, Peter, you're going to be sifted. Satan wants to come for you. He's going to sift you. And you're going to go through this. And when you are done, I want you to encourage your brothers. You know what he's saying? Peter, you're going to have the most humbling experience in your life. All your bragging, all of your sense of pride and how good and how dedicated to me you are is going to come crashing down. You're going to be shattered. And when you get back up from that, when there are other people that have that moment in life, you're going to be the guy who can say, I get it. I've been there. And you know what's going to happen? They're going to look, boy, yeah, Peter, you have, haven't you? You had that low moment. You had that thing when everything you thought about yourself came crashing down. When you did the dumbest thing imaginable in the most public way imaginable. Doesn't it help when you're down to have someone come alongside that really does get it? They really have been through it. They really have suffered that. And they can say, I went through it and here's how. And the credibility is immense, isn't it? It really helps to have that kind of thing. And God prepares us to have a ministry to people in that way. Ultimately, then, trials just make us more useful. As our passage says, God is refining us. He's maturing us. He's bringing us along. He's moving us to a place of maturity and usefulness that we didn't have before. Why do we welcome trials? Why does it say to consider it pure joy? Because God is going to make you a better person each time you get through one. God is going to refine you. God is going to make you deeper, wiser, more understanding, more careful. We sit on the elder board in our church, and a number of us have come from backgrounds of other churches and difficult circumstances and hurtful moments, and we have said this to one another time and time again. God made sure that he put men here who had been hurt somewhere, because it will remind us in our ministry to those of you in this church that we do not want to hurt you in that way ever again. By that learning, by that ability, we will say we commit ourselves to not letting that happen to the people we care for. And we remind each other of that continually to keep the wisdom to do just that. Trials are a changing thing. It took us over 1.5 years to get through the book of James when we did it. And when we looked at this, there's just some things I want to leave you with. And I leave this as your homework. And the verses that we read out of James that we went through tells us certain things. How do you get through trials? First off, a joyous attitude. The expectation that God's going to sort this out. Doesn't attitude change everything you get into? Doesn't it change every relationship? Verse 3, it says, an understanding mind. To have the clarity of thought to know that God has a purpose. To read enough scripture to know what he promised, that he keeps his promises, so that I can trust God to go through this. You need to have an understanding mind. Verse 4 tells you need to persevere. Here's the simple reality. You can't fix it. As I said, that's the hardest thing to come to grips with. Sometimes you just have to endure. To wait it out and see where God's going. Verses 6 and 8 says you'll need a believing heart. You need to trust God rather than the circumstances. That's what Abraham had to do. And in verses 9 to 11, a humble heart will help. Most of us want to ask what some of you mentioned. Why me? Well, the answer is in there. It's everyone. This is life. It isn't God picking on you. It's the fact that a fallen world brings troubles. And God has determined that those troubles that come, he will use. They will not just be something that brings you down, but something that will build you up. It is a kind God that says all things work to the good of those that believe and trust in him. I'll give that to your homework assignment to go through that. I thank you for your indulgence in letting me depart from our text in Matthew to come here. And I'm hoping that 2021 will be a bit better. But I'll be very honest, as I look at the trending, I'm wondering if we haven't seen the beginning of things that might make it worse. But we are God's people, and God carries us through these times.